Well, welcome everyone. Good morning. Welcome to our second virtual OAC meeting. We had great attendance last time and it looks again to be the same. So I really appreciate you continuing to be engaged and involved in this really important effort, because your feedback is really important to us getting to a great product that helps shape Charlotte. So thank you very much for being here and for participating in a different type of environment that we're normally used to. Today, I think we're going to talk a little bit about just some almost like zoning 101. And even if you're familiar and you work in that area a good deal and are comfortable with a lot of those terms, we may not all be. And I think even some of the new ideas that were introduced in TOD probably be good to have a conversation about and talk about some of the things that we may bring into the full UDO document. So should be a good agenda. And with that, thank you, and I'll pass it off to Tony, the chair of our committee here.
I thought I had unmuted Tony. I'm sorry, Tony. Should be unmuted now.
Hello, can you all hear me?
Yes.
I can't hear you guys, but I can go ahead and welcome everybody to the meeting, and thank you all for coming. I know this is a challenge to do things virtually, but we all certainly appreciate it, and I think it's great that we can continue to do this valuable work while we are all homebound or quarantining, or for whatever form that takes for each of us. I know that my NCDOT work is proceeding virtually as well, and I think it's important for the wheels to keep turning while we're doing these things and in these times. So thank you very much, and persevere and continue to participate. And I want to thank the staff, Alan and Laura and Allison and the whole team for all that they're doing to make this possible. And I hope that I'll be able to hear the meeting. So that's my welcome. So thank you, everybody.
All right. Thank you, Tony. With that, we'll get into the presentation in the meeting. And let me get adjusted here. I've been working at home with a one-screen laptop, and today I'm in the office with 3 monitors, so I've got to try to figure out how to advance slides. So we hope you're seeing the slide on your screen that says Foundations of UDO Zoning. And you may notice that our PowerPoint slides have a different look today than they did at our last meeting. That's because we have done some rebranding of the UDO. We did it in-house. We had been using a previous branding that had been created for us when we started the UDO effort a couple of years ago, and we thought it was time to kind of freshen the brand. So you'll be seeing this new logo and these new colors on our materials, such as our web page, our correspondence, and obviously here in the PowerPoint presentation. So we hope you like them. We do, and so let's move on from here. I know that by now most of you are all experts in using the various online meeting platforms that are available to us, whether it's Microsoft Teams or WebEx or Skype. But if you haven't used Zoom in a while, or maybe if you've never used it, and we did use Zoom for our last meeting, we're going to spend the next few minutes and slides going through some of the features of Zoom, just so you reacquaint yourself with it and you're able to get the most out of Zoom for this meeting. So the first is which version of which view that you can choose for your speakers. And there's my office phone ringing. So, if you go to the upper right, you can choose gallery view. I used to call it the Brady Bunch view, but this week I'm calling it the Hollywood Squares view. Or you can go and just choose speaker view, in which case you're only going to be viewing the person who's speaking at the time. Most of the time, though, during this meeting, what you'll be seeing on your screen will be the actual PowerPoint slide that we're talking about. So whichever view you choose is probably not going to be all that critical. And this icon will let you choose full screen view. So if you want to fill up the whole screen with the Zoom window, or you can get out of that by pressing escape or double clicking on the window or going up to the upper right and choosing another icon that lets you get out of full screen. You can, if you haven't done this already, do this now. Go to the bottom of your Zoom window and click on the participants icon. And this is going to open up a panel and you'll be able to see who's in the meeting with us. So we suggest you do that as soon as possible. And then here's something a little bit different than the way we did our last meeting. At the last meeting, we took your comments and questions by having you raise your hand in the participants panel. There's a little button at the bottom right that you could click that says raise hand. We're going to try something different this time and see how this works and see if people like it better. Instead of raising your hand and chiming in and asking your questions, we're going to ask you to type in either your questions or comments using the chat function. So click on that chat icon on the bottom of the Zoom screen to see where you can open up a box and you'll be able to type in comments or questions there. We'll be monitoring that box and we'll stop at various points throughout the meeting to address the questions or comments that we've received up until that point using chat. And then finally, if you're having audio problems with Zoom, there are some audio controls in the lower left-hand corner of the window. I don't know how they all work, but if you can figure out something that improves your audio experience, we hope that you can figure that out for yourself. And hopefully everybody can hear us well enough, and we hope that you can. If you can't for some reason, you can reach out to Kevin May of our team. His phone number is in the email notice that we sent out yesterday, or you can type in a comment that you're having a problem hearing, and we'll see if we can't help you out with that.
And Alan, just to jump in, we've gotten a couple of chat comments that it's a little hard to hear you. So you can speak a little louder. We heard that from a couple of folks.
Thank you. I will try to do that. And I don't know if there's a audio control. I'll just get a little closer to the microphone and try to speak a little louder. I'm a little self-conscious because I'm in the office with other people here. And then renaming. So we do have some people that are with us who probably came in by using a telephone, and we're going to try. I'm looking through the list of people we've got. I don't see anybody that's just a phone number. So it looks like if you joined us by telephone, you have already renamed yourself, and we thank you for that. Oh no, I do have some phone numbers.
Yeah, at the bottom.
I'm going to call out phone numbers and ask you to identify yourself, and so we can rename you. Five. Who are you?
Hi, Alan. Hi, Alan. This is Candace Rory.
Okay, Candace. I'm going to rename you if you don't mind.
I got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Candace. And then the next.
Hi, Alan. It's Maria Anderson.
Hey, Maria, thank you. And here, sorry.
This is Dave Wiggins.
Dave, thank you, Dave. I lost your phone number, but hopefully Kevin can find it. Six.
Alan, that's me. It's Tracy Newsom.
Okay.
I'm in there twice.
You're here twice. All right. We're gonna have to
Yep.
charge you twice.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. Okay. All right then. Thank you for that, and hopefully we've got everybody with their name attached so that all of us can see who's in the meeting with us. So let's move on then. We are not live streaming these virtual meetings on Facebook the way we had been doing with our in-person meetings, but we are recording this meeting, and so a recording of this meeting will be posted to the Charlotte UDO YouTube channel within the next couple of business days, if not sooner. So there's a link that you'll see on your screen to the Charlotte YouTube page. We don't have an awful lot there yet, but we'll be adding more content as we continue along. So if you want to go back and revisit a part of this meeting, or if you want to share this meeting with other people in your group who aren't here, couldn't be here, you can share the link to our YouTube channel, and they can always go and view this meeting at any time. So the procedures for today's meeting will be very similar to what we did last meeting, which seemed to go fairly well, fairly simple. The staff, mainly Laura and I and our consultants, will go through some slides on today's contents, and we'll have periodic places where we stop and try to address your comments and questions that you've been typing into the chat function. So we'll stop 2 or 3 times along the way for that. So with that said, let's look at today's meeting agenda. We thought it would be appropriate to cover some zoning basics and some new concepts that we'll be using as we move forward with the drafting of the new UDO zoning districts. Many of you are already familiar with a lot of these concepts, especially if you were with us throughout the development of the new TOD ordinance, where we've introduced a lot of these concepts to Charlotte zoning. But for our recent members, and maybe as a little bit of a refresher for some of the members that have been with us for a while, it's important that you understand these concepts before we move into drafting new UDO zoning districts, because a lot of our zoning districts will feature some of these new concepts, and sometimes not just new concepts, but just zoning basics that you need to know. So our next meeting, we'll get into zoning districts, but before we did that, we thought it would be a good idea to go and just recover this material for our former members that have been with us for a while, and this will be some new ground, obviously, for some of our more recent members. So with that, I think, Laura, will I turn the meeting over to you at this point for the next few slides? Laura? I haven't muted Laura, have I?
Okay, sorry, I needed to unmute myself.
Oh.
Thanks, Alan. We'll probably go over the outline at most meetings so that everyone can see where we are in the UDO outline. So we want to talk about that just a little bit. And then, as Alan said, we'll be moving into some zoning concepts. So that the way that we plan on organizing the UDO is with obviously the introductory provisions, and then a large component will be the zoning portion of the ordinance. And we've talked about use definitions so far, so we've made some progress on that. We'll then be talking with you guys and getting feedback on the different districts and the standards that go with the districts. And then there'll be another component, the general development standards, which will be things like parking and buffers and loading requirements that are generally standards that apply to many districts. And so that is something, after we've gone through the individual districts, we'll go through those broader set of standards. The next component will be subdivision, streets, and infrastructure. So we'll be moving the subdivision regs as well as things that are in different parts of city code related to streets and infrastructure into one common section. One thing that'll be a little bit different for those of you that are used to working with our current zoning ordinance is that the streetscape standards that are currently in our zoning ordinance will be moved into this section. So that would be sidewalk and areas for street tree planting. Then we'll move on to natural resources, and we have a number of regs right now related to natural resources, including the tree ordinance, erosion control, post-construction stormwaters, our stormwater regs, watershed regs, floodplain. All of those will be grouped in this section. And at the end, someone will remind me, and Allison, if you have a minute to maybe talk about the work that we're doing on tree canopy as well, which will help guide some of this. And then finally, we'll be looking at UDO administration and approvals process, nonconformities, and enforcement. Next slide. So uses, we have been talking about use categories, definitions, and at the previous meetings, and got a lot of great feedback from you guys, which we really appreciate. And we thought, well, before we go forward, we should probably tell you how these will be used. So if we go to the next slide, the first way that we'll use them as principal uses. So we will identify for each zoning district what uses are allowed as principal uses, and those are the main uses of a structure or a lot. And just, we'll say this now, but say this again, in most situations, you will be able to have more than one principal use on a lot. That won't be true for our single family situations, but otherwise you could have more than one use. And you can see on the slide a series of types of principal uses that you would see, the main use on a lot. And then we have accessory uses, and that is a use that's on the same side as the principal use, but it's incidental and subordinate. It's not the main use. And so if something is allowed as a principal use, it would also be allowed as accessory. And we will, well, that would probably still be a second principal use. But we have some accessory uses that we have identified and been talking about, such as a drive-through facility, outdoor entertainment components that go along with that principal use. Temporary uses are uses that are allowed for a time period, but not permanently, and have to be discontinued at the end of that time period. They don't involve construction of a permanent structure. Some of the temporary uses, mobile food vendors, temporary outdoor sales, real estate project offices, that does look like a somewhat permanent structure. But typically it's not a permanent structure. It's there for a time period on a lot. And the time periods could vary by use as we get into the regs. And then prescribed conditions, and these could be for principal, accessory, or temporary uses, and they are specific conditions that go with a use. So we have, I'll pick the one on the right, microbrewery, micro distillery, micro winery. require that they include a restaurant, bar, or tasting room in certain districts currently in our ordinance. So we may say this use is allowed with these conditions. And again, the conditions could vary by zoning district and by use. So I think we wanted to stop at this point, and if anyone had any questions or comments, ask you to put them in the chat, and if not, we will move on. So we'll wait just a second and see. Not seeing anything, so Alan?
Yep.
Take it away.
Okay. I'm going to spend the next several slides going over some zoning concepts, and some of them are not even concepts, they're just basic zoning requirements, just so that we all have a common understanding of what they are and how they're used and how they will be used in the UDO. So we've got 9 concepts here that we'll cover in today's meeting, starting with the streets map. The Charlotte Streets Map is being developed by CDOT, and there you see what, there's a link to, a bit.ly link to Charlotte Streets Map, but if you don't want to remember that and you Google Charlotte Streets Map, you will find it. It's also available from CDOT's webpage. So far, the streets map only includes the areas that are adjacent to the Blue Line light rail corridor. And it was developed first because we were doing the TOD ordinance, and that's where we did our TOD alignment rezoning. And so we wanted to make sure that we had an adopted streets map for those areas that we rezoned to TOD this past November. So what you're seeing on the screen is what has been adopted by City Council so far for a streets map. Eventually, CDOT will develop a streets map that includes the entire city. So it is a map of the arterial street network with collectors in some local streets, but not all local streets, and also has the Cross Charlotte Trail included. And the streets map will be used to show what the desired or expected street cross-section is to complement new development. And it will provide a predictable measurement from the street center line to the future back of curb. Prior to the streets map, we used area plan cross-sections to determine the location of the future back of curb, which is important for some of our urban zoning districts because they get their setbacks, which we'll talk about later, from the location of the future back of curb. But if a street didn't have an adopted cross-section in a area plan, sometimes it wasn't predictable to determine where that future back of curb was. And so using the streets map and measuring future back of curb from the street center line, we should always be able to find that point on these streets that are included in the streets map. The other thing that we're going to be using the streets map for is to provide us with information to determine our frontages when we get into zoning districts, and we're going to talk about frontages in a few minutes. So the streets map is an interactive map. The online streets map, I should say, is interactive. And so you'll see various streets have a different color assigned to them. The colors correspond to the type of street that they are. So if you click on a color segment of the streets map, you'll call up some information on the right-hand side of the screen. It will show you the street classification. In this case, it's a 2+ lane avenue. It will show you the limits of the street segment. And again, in this case, we are looking at the information from a color drive. from North Tryon Street to West W.T. Harris Boulevard. It will also show you the distance from the street center line to the future back of curb, which again is very important, and any additional information that might be appropriate to share with that. It will also include a small thumbnail cross-section diagram, and if you click on that, you'll open up this larger cross-section, which shows what is expected to occur in between the curbs of that particular street. And in this case, we're looking at a 2 to 3 lane avenue, and it is showing us the number of travel lanes, which are 1 travel lane each direction on this particular example. Center space, there is a center space here, a bike lane, and if this were a street cross-section that had on-street parking associated with it, you would also see the location of the on-street parking. So basically, travel lanes, center space, bicycle facilities, and any on-street parking, as well as where we will measure the future back of curb from. So in this case, you can see that we've taken the center line of the street, which is right in the middle of the center space, and then measured over to the back of the curb. And if I recall from the last slide, I think in this example, our width is 24 feet from the center line of the road to the future back of curb. So once we establish that point, we can then establish our zoning setbacks. But we do have to know where the future back of curb is. I'm going to toss it back to Laura then to talk about frontages, and then we'll pause for questions and comments in a short time. Laura?
Thanks, Alan. Frontages are a concept that we introduced for the first time with our TOD districts. And frankly, a little bit of a challenging concept as we've been getting used to doing something really new for us. So we've worked through frontages and tried to adjust them to make them a little bit clearer than what we currently have in TOD, and want to test that with you guys today and see if this makes more sense and if folks can understand how we're handling this. So to start off, a frontage is, if you think about a lot or a building, it is the frontage of that lot or building. And something as a side of a lot or building is classified as a frontage if it faces an existing street or an ordinance required public or private street. So I don't know if Alan could maybe with his cursor show where that is on the graphic attached, if that will show up for folks. I'm not positive with this technology. It would also, you would have a frontage, a lot frontage if you are, thanks Alan, if you are next to a street designated on an adopted streets map, and Alan just talked about the streets map, that would create a frontage for that part of your lot. If you are next to, and this is something we have clarified in the TOD text amendment, if you have a platted right-of-way offered for dedication, I know this is really in the weeds, but that is at least 30 feet in width, that would create a frontage situation. And then finally, if you are next to a public space, such as an open space, a public path, and that critically being a public path, transit corridor in certain conditions creates a frontage. And the frontages have a number of, with some districts, requirements with them. So if we go to the next page, again, as I said, this was a new concept that we introduced with TOD, and frontages are used to determine your setbacks, sidewalk widths, planning and amenity zones, and various dimensional and design standards. So we've adjusted the wording a bit for frontage types, and in a minute we'll show how they relate to street classifications, because they're related, but they're not the same. So we have this list of frontage types, and this is a bit of an update. So we have a number of different primary frontages if you're on a main street, if you're on a 4 or more lane avenue or boulevard, if you are on a 2 or 3 lane avenue. And then we have other types of frontages, and we'll show you how those are created that are primary other. Then we have secondary frontages, and then we have some unique classifications a unique classification for limited access and parkway. Hopefully, when we get to the next slide, make a little bit more sense. So sorry, a lot of information in a matrix. But one thing we found a bit challenging and tried to enhance is how you determine what your frontage type is. So that could be determined based on your street classification. So you can see in the left-hand column, if you are classified, if your frontage is along a main street, you'll be a primary main street frontage type. And then for your standards in the ordinance, you will go in and find your standards based on being next to a primary main street. And so a number of situations created by your street classification and conditions. Then, as I mentioned, we have limited access and parkway as another frontage type that is not considered a primary or secondary. Again, when we get into the regs, hopefully this will be a bit clearer. And then we have some special conditions that create primary frontages. And we could, as we go through the ordinance, find that there are more special conditions that we should be considering, but this is what we have so far through Todd. So if you are next to a transit station, that frontage along the transit line where you're abutting the transit station would be a primary other frontage type. If you are next to a transit corridor having pedestrian access, the same. And just a little bit of clarification, every lot will have at least one frontage designated as a primary frontage. So maybe you're on a local street that doesn't meet any of the other criteria, and you only have one frontage, the front of your lot facing that street. That will make that frontage a primary frontage. You might have more based on the your street classifications or conditions, more than one primary frontage. For the non-local streets, the arterials, you will find that street classification on the streets map. And for the local streets, that will be determined as those streets are currently classified or built through subdivision regs. Next slide. So here's an example. We have Camden Road in South End, and it is classified as a main street. So based on that, your frontage designation is a primary main street, and you might go into, say, the setback portion of the district, and in this case, this is TOD, and you would find the setback for a primary main street. Another example on the next slide is on the rail trail. Again, in South End, we have mostly TOD examples because that's where we have applied this first. So you have a special condition, which is a transit corridor having pedestrian access. That's with the rail trail. And that based on that special condition, your frontage designation along that side is a primary frontage and of the other category.
Laura, we've got another break in here for questions and comments.
Yes. And we have some.
Okay.
So, and we're going to ask, we also have, just to let you guys know for questions and comments, we have our consultant team from Camira, Sarissa Strungis and Chris Jeanette to help us. And we also on some of the streets map questions, we have Tracy Newsom from CDOT. So let's start with, first question is, being a GIS web-based document, is the streets map an adopted document or live that is constantly updated by staff? And say, Tracy, can you answer that one for us? And we may
Okay,
have,
can you hear me?
yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. It is an adopted document. So the TOD streets map for the blue line was adopted last fall, and it is not constantly updated by staff. There are some changes that might need to occur as amendments, and actually at the end of today's discussion, I'll describe some of that that's coming up in the next few weeks, but it is an adopted document.
Thanks, Tracy.
Mm-hmm.
The next question is, let's see, is the overall right-of-way established elsewhere? And that would be in the, yes, that would be in the subdivision, streets and infrastructure section of the ordinance, as we'll be getting to that down the road. From Eric Zaverl, to clarify, the final design details are not set in stone, right? It mostly is used for setbacks, back of curb measurements. And I'm assuming this is the streets map component. Tracy, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. And Eric, I know we've talked about this a few times, so you're just wanting that clarification in this discussion. I get that. So the way that the streets map has been described here is how it is used as part of the UDO and of the development ordinance. The cross sections that are shown are intended to be kind of expected cross sections that would also be used as a start for capital projects as well. But having said that, and to your point, at the point that an actual project is planned and designed and funded and under construction, there would be some design details that would likely vary based on very specific circumstances. And I think the best example of that that we've talked about before is that there is space included for a variety of different categories of bike facilities, but that the exact bike facility used for a specific location would be left to the design decision as part of an actual project. So there are different categories, and within those categories, the exact facility would be designed as part of the project. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. A question, since design impacts speed on streets, will posted speed be listed for street segments? And I'll answer the first part of this and ask then Tracy to chime in. The UDO, the development ordinance, will not have that in there, but Tracy, do you want to talk about how maybe that ties to the streets map or doesn't tie to it, how that's handled?
We had actually, that's an interesting question. We had not actually intended or expected to put posted speed for different street segments on there. Obviously, design impacts operating speeds, and posted speeds may or may not, would typically want to be close to those. We would probably not put those in the streets map, but certainly as we've gone through the work to define the way streets would be used in place sites and in the comp plan and how that might translate into the UDO, we have streets that we are expecting to be slower speed streets. But we would not expect that the posted speed would be on the actual streets map. We can talk more about that in another setting if we need to, but right now that's not in there.
Thank you, Tracy. One thing I would say as we're going through these questions, if you've asked this or anyone else and you feel like we're really not getting you the information that you need, please feel free to reach out to us after the meeting or even add more back into the chat. So another question for Tracy is, how does the streets map relate to the highway streets map in CRTPO's state mandated comprehensive transportation plan?
So the development of the streets map includes bringing in information from already other adopted documents, other adopted policies and policy documents, and the CTP, the Comprehensive Transportation Plan, is one of them. So that when we look at the Comprehensive Transportation Plan has a highway map or a streets map, if it's not an actual highway, that lists which streets are need improvement. That's one of the categories used. And so our estimation of the number of lanes that are shown on the streets map is based on the adopted CTP.
Thank you, Tracy. The question that I think goes back to the frontages and says, why are we not considering common open space that is private? And what are the dimensional requirements of the open space? Well, say that the open space that is private will be handled in the ordinance, and we'll get to that in a bit. So I didn't have an answer for that today. We have some requirements where, and I might ask Arista and or Chris also to jump in as well, or Alan. We have some requirements when you're abutting, in some cases, open space on your site, but we wouldn't see that creating a frontage, because with that comes a number of standards, including setbacks, that may not be appropriate for when you're abutting private open space. Arista and Chris, can you maybe give some additional feedback on that? Can someone make sure those guys are unmuted?
There we go. Sorry, I forgot it was muted. I think basically you've kind of covered it, really, how we're addressing private open space. Really trying to think, I mean, what we're talking about in terms of these frontages, it's really the public access that's going on along these frontages that abut open space. And I think it would be something quite different and is handled differently when it's private open space. I don't know that it necessarily needs to be brought into the frontages. I don't know if Chris has anything to add. It's just, as you said, it's something that's handled slightly differently within the larger ordinance.
Thanks, Arista. Unless Chris has anything to add, we'll jump to the next question.
Oh, good.
Chris?
No, nothing else.
Okay, thank you. We have a question. If you have a back alley for service, that would be secondary, right? And then this would be a situation where graphics such as a section diagram can help a lot. So yes, thank you. Any feedback you guys have to how we can more clearly present concepts, we'd be very open to. That would be really helpful. And as for a back alley for service, that's a really good thought. And something we need to think about. We haven't identified that as a frontage and at this point, and we may just have some standards abutting that, but we may need to think about that as a frontage. Arista, Chris, have you guys seen how this has been handled in other communities, and any thoughts on how we may want to look at alleys?
Well, as you know, I live in Chicago, so we have alleys everywhere. So we're very used to the alley condition. Typically, we wouldn't treat it as a frontage type because what we're going to do is really, it's going to be abutting the rear yard. I think you're going to jump to rear yards in a second. And you'd be treating the condition of it being in that rear yard. It wouldn't have the kind of more elaborate frontage standards that these other areas have because it's a different type of public access. So it's not that we're ignoring alleys, it's just that they're treated very differently based on their functionality and the fact that, you know, they don't have a pedestrian path going down them. They're used for that kind of service in the back.
Thanks, Arista. And again, as we get into this, alleys is an old concept and yet a new concept for us. So lots more discussion on that coming. The question, can we get some other street classifications and typology using NACTO? Maybe. I think this is really relates to street classifications, and I will turn this over to Tracy.
Sure. Partially, I guess I need to better understand the question to give the fullest answer. I would say there are probably more flavors of street on the streets map than there really is in the way they're classified for frontages. So we've tried to combine from a frontage perspective. I think what planning is trying to do is to combine some of the street classifications into categories that allow them to be used for frontages. And so if the question is getting at, there are certain types of different designs for streets where there are different kinds of priorities or there are different kinds of contexts, I think a lot of that is handled and can be handled using the classifications we have and the way the streets map is set up that allows for very context-based cross sections to be applied. So I just want to clarify that. For example, there are a lot of different flavors of avenues and how they might look for different contexts, particularly when we start looking at place types and how they're mapped, for example. So I wouldn't say no, that we can't look at more street types or classifications. We know there's a lot of rich information in NACTO. There's some places that we might want to look at things a little differently. But I also think that we currently have, at this point, the classifications we're using allow us a lot of that flexibility in different kinds of cross sections. So I don't know if I answered the question because I'm not really sure what the intent is.
Well, and I think just so that everyone also sees this comment, which is related, is I think from Eric, following up on the street typologies, many of them are not urban in nature, having specific urban typologies like transit corridor, neighborhood main street, urban neighborhood street, residential boulevard, etc. And I think as we get into the street section of the ordinance, particularly for the local streets, maybe that's a chance to relook at even some of the naming and the cross sections. We had, and going back up again.
Can I add something to that, Laura? I'm sorry, real quick. Can I add something?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the streets map is typically not going to have the local streets on it, but yes, they would be part of that streets and subdivision chapter where we would define the different local streets.
So, thank you. The next is a comment that I think definitely is very helpful for us about typical photographs and the use of Camden as a main street, pointing out that it's really a one-sided street for most of its length, so we probably need to find a better example. And so, point taken. Trying to get through these quickly because we got a bit more to go and don't want to hold people too late past when we said we'd end, but really appreciate the comments. From Nate, are you anticipating much like Todd that the private developer would use the streets map for building setback, but not necessarily build a future curb location unless installing on-street parking? I think when you say I think that's a discussion we need to have as we move forward, and maybe leave it at that now, and we will, as we get into the subdivision streets and infrastructure section, talk about that. Are there situations when it would benefit someone to move the street? Not knowing that we really have an answer. The next comment to Tracy's point, you could list a range of acceptable design speeds so we can get an idea, but can evaluate based on specific circumstances based on the street type. I have a lot of thoughts on the open space frontage issue, and yes, we'll be glad to circle up with you, Thomas, separately. Comment, I think the next one is just a comment. Speed limits are both a design matter and a political matter. Probably not put speed limits in the ordinance, and I think we agree we're not regulating, for the most part, what's happening in the public right of way or in streets, though we do talk about street design in the UDO. Alleys are used a lot in master planning, and I totally agree. We need to go back and actually the subdivisions streets team is looking at alleys and how we might apply them in our community. And then following up on that, I think David Walters said, I haven't produced a master plan for several years that hasn't used alleys as an important element of public space. So yes, we're looking forward to having that conversation with you guys. Okay, you guys had a lot of comments, and this is really thought-provoking for our team. So we appreciate it. Alan's going to move on to the next section, and we'll have a chance for more chat.
Okay, thanks, Laura. Yeah, those were some great questions, and we've got some follow-up to do with some of those. So let's get back into our zoning basics and concepts section. Let's talk about setbacks. And most of you are familiar with the term setback. In our current zoning, we only use the term setback as it applies to the street frontage side of a parcel of land. Or if it's a corner lot, it would have 2 street setbacks. But going forward in the UDO, we are also calling the setbacks on the side parcel lines and the rear parcel lines. We're identifying those as setbacks. In our current zoning, we call those side yards and rear yards, but going forward, they will all be setbacks. So as you can see in the diagram, you'll have a frontage setback along the street sides of a parcel, and the parcels of land are the beige colored rectangles. The street frontage would be the burnt orange color, and then your side setback lines would be indicated in gray, and the rear setback lines in that taupe, I guess is what you'd call it, color. Very colorful graphic. And obviously the distance of those setbacks will vary according to zoning district. So for some, you may have a wider side yard setback than in other zoning districts. So fairly simple concept. I think one that we're probably all familiar with. Just going forward, we're making an adjustment to our terminology. So instead of side yards and rear yards, we've got side setbacks and rear setbacks. The build-to zone is a concept that was rolled out when we did our TOD ordinance a couple of years ago. And it, along with some of the others that we're going to be introducing, are common to form-based codes. And while the UDO and our new zoning in UDO will share some form-based elements, it's not strictly a form-based code, but we will be using some form-based elements. And the build-to zone is one of those. And the concept is that in certain kinds of places, we want new buildings to be built close to the street or to the back of the sidewalk to create an urban public realm. So this differs in setback from a setback requirement in that a setback is the minimum or rather, yes, the minimum distance a building can be built to the street, but you can go deeper into the lot. If you don't have a build-to zone and you just have a setback, you can build your building 50 feet from the back of the sidewalk or 100 feet, and you've got a big giant front lawn if that's what you want to do. With the build-to zone, it forces the building closer to the street so that we create that urban street edge that we're looking for in various place types. The distance could be variable in TOD, for example, depending on the frontage. In the TOD district, our build-to zone is 0 to 10 feet, with 0 being right at the minimum setback line and 10 feet being the farthest back you can start your building. In other districts, it could be 0 to 20 feet, so you can push the building a little further into the site if that's what you want to do. We're thinking that not all zoning districts in the UDO will have a build-to zone requirement. I'm thinking, for example, industrial zoning districts where this may not be important or appropriate to include, but this will be in the kind of place types where we want good urban walkable neighborhoods. We'll be using the build to zone. Or chime in if I've missed any thoughts on that, or Chris and Arista. If not, we'll go to the next slide, which is a build to percentage, which is related to the build to zone. And what this requirement will govern is for the building facade that's located in that build to zone, this requirement governs how much of that facade, what percentage of that facade actually has to be located in the build to zone, so that you can see in the graphic on the screen, we've got kind of an L-shaped building. So along the frontage, on the left-hand frontage, you can see that the facade, the majority of the facade of that building is located in the green build to zone, but then we've got an indentation at the corner, and maybe that's open space or maybe that's something else, but the full face of that building is not located within the green build to zone. So our build to percentage requirement tells us how much of that building facade has to actually be in that green build to zone. And again, this won't be a requirement in every zoning district, but the ones where we do have it, that percentage of building in the build to zone will probably vary from one zoning district to another. And this is yet another related requirement, and this is the minimum building length as a percentage of the lot width along the frontage. So that's a lot of words, but really what it means, and it's a concept that we have now in the old TOD, but what it governs is that for a new building on a parcel, a certain percentage of the width of that parcel, the frontage of that parcel, has to be occupied by a building, so that you can't put a very small building on the parcel and then leave the rest of that frontage as open, whether it's open space or parking lot or something. This governs how much of that lot frontage has got to be actually building edge. And again, this won't apply necessarily in every single zoning district as we go forward, but the ones that it will apply to will probably have slightly different requirements depending on the zoning district and on the type of frontage that the building is located on. Chris, Arista, Laura, anything to add to that? Okay. We may have some questions about that as we get to our next stopping point. So let's move on. Transparency, I think, is something that we all probably understand what this is and why we have it. We have transparency requirements in many of our current urban zoning districts, such as UMUD, MUD, and TOD. And these rules are designed to create a more vibrant, interesting, and walkable public realm by requiring clear glass windows and doors along a certain percentage of the building facade. And the percentage will vary, again, according to the frontage type and the zoning district, with the thought being that as pedestrians, as we're walking along a street, especially an urban street, we want to be able to look in for it. It just creates a more interesting, activated public realm to be able to look into buildings as we pass by, rather than walking alongside a blank wall or something like that. So again, this is not a new concept to Charlotte zoning, but we are kind of nailing it down and redefining it and what it means and how we measure it as we go forward. Blank walls is kind of related to the transparency concept. And again, to create more public interest in in the public realm and a better walkable environment, we have standards that will limit the amount of blank wall, typically measured as a horizontal and a vertical distance. How much wall you can have as a blank wall that is not embellished with windows and doors or decorative elements. such as banding or medallions or artwork like murals and mosaics, or a change in wall plane or other architectural or material embellishments. So a typical example would be in an urban district, that number may be 20 feet. So we may have a standard that says you can't have more than 20 feet of a blank wall before you've got to introduce one of these elements to embellish that for greater pedestrian interest and visual interest on the blank wall. Again, we've had this standard in our urban zoning districts for some time now. Modulation is another design standard that relates to the walkability of a street and how a building relates to the public realm and the human scale. And this applies typically to very long building facades. You wouldn't necessarily have a standard, this standard may not apply unless you've got a longer building. In the case of our recent TOD, we've got a standard that says that if your building is 150 feet in length or longer, that you have got to modulate your facade, break up the wall plane of the facade at least 2 feet in depth every certain number of feet, just to provide some more visual interest and to break that a large building down into a more human scale elements. The photo example you see on your screen is Tranquil Court on Selwyn Avenue, and that building is about 250 feet long along Selwyn Avenue, but as you're walking along, because it's very well modulated and it's built to a human scale, it doesn't overwhelm you. It doesn't overwhelm the pedestrian environment. And that is the conclusion of our, the main portion of our presentation, our zoning basics and zoning concepts. We're going to pause now for questions and comments, and we will try to get see where we left off with comments and try to respond to those before we close out today's meeting. So Laura or Kevin, help me out and let's see where we left off so we can make sure we pick up with the most recent comment.
I think with David Walters, I'll read this one out, Alan, and then you can run from here.
Okay.
Where he said, glad to see build-to zones and high-intensity urban situations. It's often helpful to talk about build-to zones, emphasizing the proper enclosure of public space. Glad to see build-to lines as part of urban zoning. And let me just, I'll just read a couple that also go with that. Seconding, this is from Brent Gilroy, seconding David's praise for the build-to, and David apologizing about a typo he had. He said he got excited.
Spelling doesn't, yeah, spelling doesn't count in Zoom.
So yeah, we're excited to have this. Alan, you want to go on to Thomas had a little bit different, well, not a different perspective, but kind of reinforcement and a thought on expanding build-to zones. You want to read that one and talk?
Yeah, let's see. Thomas's comment he would argue that all situations would benefit from a build-to zone, not setbacks, to enhance the public realm. Improved public realm should not be the sole benefit of urban areas. I think that is something that we can discuss. I think we have discussed it as we were moving along, whether a build-to zone would be appropriate in all zoning districts. And the obvious possible exception that comes to my mind is some industrial districts. As we think about industrial uses or business parks or things like that, which don't always have a public realm, and in some cases, they're not necessarily intended to be walkable. Whether bringing those buildings up closer to the street and having some sort of a build-to zone is necessarily what we want universally. But I take the point, and I think it's something that we can discuss. Arista or Chris, if you've got any thoughts about build-to zones and how they could, whether they should be applied universally or more specifically and strategically in just urban environments?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Alan, you're really getting at it. It's the idea of, we think build-to zones are great as well. And I don't think it's just necessarily in TOD urban environments. I think what you'll see as we're drafting this is that it is being applied a lot more broadly to even, say, more suburban commercial areas that would be applicable. But things like industrial often, and not necessarily that we want to discourage a good public realm in industrial areas, sometimes just for the function of industrial buildings, that setback needs to be more flexible. You need to be able to move it around, in particular if you're doing some kind of cross-dock loading. You can't really hamper where the building goes as you're trying to adjust for things that happen on the site. So while I think the idea, or in things like single family, a lot of times, in particular larger lot single family, you wouldn't want to do a build-to zone if you can help it, just to keep that kind of flexibility in place. But I think what you will see in the UDO is a much broader applicability of build-to zones and build-to lines in kind of any commercial area in particular where you've got any kind of pedestrian environment going on. We're going to want to use that tool as much as possible.
Yeah, and I would just second that as well and say that it's a tool that can be tailored in ways that you're not seeing within the TOD. So for instance, in TOD, we generally have 0 to 10 foot, 0 to 20 foot. If we're moving into sort of more suburban environments, we can actually tailor that so that it's not 0, but it's 10 feet to 15 feet. So we're actually looking at a development pattern and reinforcing that development pattern through the build-to zone, not just sort of creating that urban environment, but also sort of reinforcing good walkable qualities in a variety of sort of different patterns.
Okay, thank you, Chris and Arista. Next question, the transparency requirement needs a mechanism for enforcement after certificates of occupancy are issued, otherwise they get covered up after the fact. What the comment is referring to is that there may be a transparency requirement for clear windows and doors, for example, and the building gets built according to plan and it's approved and it meets all of the transparency requirements of the zoning ordinance. And then the occupant of the building, say it's a commercial building, decides that they want to cover up their windows with advertisements or something else to block the transparency. That would be a zoning violation, and we do have a mechanism for enforcing that, and I think that we do. So I don't know that we need anything else other than what we already have for zoning enforcement. Oftentimes, though, we aren't always aware of these violations unless they're called to our attention, and we can send a zoning inspector out. So we don't necessarily have a mechanism for routinely going back and checking to make sure that the 60% transparency requirement is being maintained, unless we do get comments or happen to notice in a drive-by. Laura, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you got it, Alan.
Yeah. There's a remark that the town of Davidson had to fight a pharmacy for this transparency. So yes, I'm very familiar with that pharmacy. I know what you're talking about. Oh, apparently lots of people know or are familiar with that pharmacy in Davidson. Yes, they did put shelving against the back windows. I believe that's where their greeting cards are, and block the transparency. So they refused to issue a CO until they complied. Okay, next comment. Can the staff point to the city council adopted policies that support or require the building design rules that were just presented? Just curious. City council adopted policies that support or require the building design rules. Well, I think our general development policies or GDPs, for one, support a number of those design rules, as do some of our adopted area plans.
And Alan, if I can jump in on this too, as we'll be bringing you guys place types and discussions that have happened through the comprehensive plan. So we're not necessarily looking at these rules as the only way to accomplish the objectives, but we think that this is the best way that we have found to accomplish some of the objectives and the vision in those different policy documents, both what we have now and also we're really going to be responding to the work coming out of the comprehensive plan as we bring you individual zoning districts, and we will show you that connection.
Okay, our next comment. Build to zones need more work from lessons learned in TOD. Grade relationships and slopes across frontages are still not considered in TOD and create major issues with design and compliance. Yeah, the world is not flat, and so every slope sites present their own challenges. I think this is a follow-up conversation to find out exactly what some of those concerns are that still exist that we can maybe address as we go forward. Build to lines don't necessarily mean up to the street, simply a way of defining compatible edge conditions. Yeah, that's true. They could be a build to line, as I said, or a build to zone. We don't have build to lines, although in some codes there is a line, but ours is a zone of usually typically starting at 0, which would be at the setback, and going into the site any distance from 10 feet to 20 feet is what we're using so far in TOD. So that is true that there is some wiggle room in that build to zone to hopefully accommodate slope and other site conditions, but if not, we'll have to figure out how to deal with some of those conditions. Next comment, we have worked in municipalities that have build to zones for industrial parks. In short, it does not work for our tenants and clients. I'm happy to have an offline conversation with a smaller group about this. So yes, that is a point of view that we're hearing that will just kind of back up what we've said about build to zones in some industrial areas, that it may not work everywhere. So that's a discussion that we can continue to have. John, we look forward to having that discussion with you and anyone else who is interested. I'm going to skip to the last comment that I see on my screen from Carmela, looking forward to hearing more about industrial zones and uses the next time and how these things will apply. Yeah, and that's exactly why we wanted to cover some of these things before we do get into our industrial zoning districts, which will be the next thing that we'll get together on. So that as you see some of these concepts, and again, industrial are zoning districts where a lot of these, especially these urban design kind of requirements, may not apply, but some of them will, and we wanted everybody to get a foundation on what these things are, so that when we go forward with industrial and all of our other zoning districts in the future, we can say, yeah, I remember what a build to zone is, and why aren't we using it here, or why is it this distance, or you've got that foundation. Not that we can't go back and re-review, but we wanted to start out everybody on having a common ground and understanding of what these concepts are, because we do have some more recent members that haven't been through TOD or some of the other things that a lot of us have been through, where we were introduced to some of these things. So I don't see any other comments on my screen. Before we move on to our conclusion, let me just hold it open here for another minute or so if anybody wants to jump in. If not, we will move to our concluding slide and we'll wrap things up.
Hey, Alan, could I just ask folks, since we did the hand raising last time and the chat function this time, as we're wrapping up, if you could just tell us kind of what you liked about either one of them. Are there other ways that you think we could get input during these sessions? But really would like to hear kind of what do you think about the approaches that we've taken? And thank you to Thomas for the first response.
And one thing that I noticed, maybe it's the material, but at our last meeting, which was our first virtual meeting using Zoom, we used the raise hand feature, and we didn't have an awful lot of comments. And it seems like today, using chat, we did get more comments, and I don't know whether that's because people are a little shy about raising their hand and they prefer to give us a written comment, or whether just the written comment is easier for everybody to use. It seems like the way the comments are coming in now through chat, that people do seem to like that better than raising of the hands. All right. With that, I'm going to head over to our final slide, and we'll talk about what's coming up next. And the first thing we'll talk about is the streets map update, and I'd like to invite Tracy Newsom from CDOT to jump in here and tell us what's going on.
Okay, thanks. And actually, this kind of relates to a question that was asked earlier in the presentation. A couple of things to let the group know about. As we already said, there is an adopted streets map that incorporates the blue line and the blue line extension for TOD. The idea is to expand that streets map to incorporate the whole city, all the arterial streets in the city. We are beginning work on that, and anticipate that we'll give updates on that to this group as we go along, and incorporate some of the comments even we've heard today, and maybe reach out to some of you with the idea that we probably will be working in kind of tandem with the timing for the UDO itself. Our thought is that we should be working kind of in the longer term view of this, that we'll be looking towards having some sort of engagement starting on that in the spring of next year, and then moving forward from that towards adoption around the same time as the UDO. A shorter term item to let folks be aware of is that there are a few cleanup minor amendments to the streets map that we have put into are anticipating doing, pardon my articulation here, that we are anticipating for the TOD streets map. And it kind of coincides with the next item on this list, which is the Todd text amendment. And so we've got kind of 3 small sets of minor amendments to the Todd streets map that we would like to take to council. We, at this point, anticipate receiving comments, public comments on those at the June 8th council meeting, with the idea that those amendments would be adopted on July 13th by council. What we'll do is we are updating the website, the streets map website, to describe what those amendments are so that people can be aware of them. And can provide comments to us, or if they want to provide comments at that meeting on the 8th. So it's a quick update.
Thank you, Tracy. We also wanted to call your attention to the public hearing on Monday, May 18th, where City Council will be holding a virtual online public hearing as part of their rezoning meeting on the TOD text amendment. And on our next Ordinance Advisory Committee meeting, which we are tentatively scheduling for 2 weeks from today, that's May 28th, we will get into the actual industrial zoning districts. We'll be sending you some information prior to that meeting, and we'll be looking for your feedback to us on the industrial districts. Laura, do you want to add anything to what I've said?
No, other than really appreciate the way that you guys have participated today. And again, if you look through these materials and want to touch base with any of the UDO team individually, we'd be glad to talk through them with you. Looking forward to moving on next time and really getting into more of the meat of the UDO.
Thanks. And Taiwo, if you're still with us, would you like to say anything to close out our meeting?
Yes, I want to say thank you, everyone.
Today, really, I think this was engaging. A lot of thoughts, expressed and ideas. Like Alison said at the beginning, it looks like we had a very, very good participation the last two meetings. Really appreciate that. I will encourage you to continue to share your thoughts with us even before the next meeting. I saw some things on the chat that you all prefer the chat, and I read a lot of the questions as well and making notes of them, but I also want to thank our consultants and staff for being responsive to a lot of those questions. But if there are outstanding questions that you still have, please do not hesitate to provide them to Alan, and we will make sure to get back to you before our next meeting. So once again, thank you so much. This is very valuable for us, and it allows us to keep moving on this and making progress on this very important project. So thank you.
Thank you, Ty. And with that, we will end our meeting. And I want to thank you all again for joining us today. Nice to see everybody here. And stay safe and well, and hopefully we'll see you at our next meeting in a couple of weeks.